Ahoy! The New World March update is making its way onto PTR and we have the patch notes, and it's the biggest changes to the game I've ever seen. Forget everything you know about New World because it's about to be different, and there are some very interesting things in here. Not all positive, but a lot of positive, so yeah, forget your shirking on light armor, forget your weapons, forget everything. Let's start, let's see what is in here. We're going to skip over some of the minor changes, as you can see here, for example. We're really going to focus on the important stuff because otherwise it's just too much to go through. Nice quality of life change here is mutated materia being added to the cache of mutated armaments, of which we will get some in the season pass. The PvP flagging tooltip now includes gathering and global luck. Curses are now being removed when the final boss in an expedition is killed, so you can no longer kill your own teammates. The elemental resist effects were removed from all mutations, so you no longer have a reduction to elemental damage and you can use whichever magical weapon you want to use. Some specific AI, however, will still have inherent resistances. And now we're getting to the meat of things, the combat changes. First we have a new Heartrune, the Firestorm, which creates a tornado that damages targets in its path. Next, the mitigation formula is updated. On one hand, this affects gear score, so there's more balance between different gear scores, but more importantly, and this is massive for everyone, Fortify and Rend now directly scale with the player's armor rating. Increased Fortify and Rend caps to account for these changes. This means that if you're wearing light armor and you're getting Fortify, the increase is going to be significantly lower than it was beforehand, and this is going to have massive implications for everything. This means on light armor, Shirking Fortification is probably not worth it because you're just going to get a little bit more armor scaling of that, so maybe get like 50 extra armor of that. The whole PvE meta may also change, maybe not, depending, because you may need to have some con or something to survive some situations in expeditions. You can still work around this with gems, those are not affected, and maybe not that much will change, you just have to play a bit better, but especially around bosses where you can't just gem against everything in the expedition and the bosses at once fully, this will mean you take more damage. You can't just stand in a fortifying sacred ground and be like, okay, I have almost capped out fortification anyway, so I take 50% less damage. You're just going to take a little less damage because you have a little more armor, but in light armor, it really isn't that much. This means that in heavy armor, Fortify will probably still be fairly valuable, but even there we have to see how the scaling is affected exactly. It might still make a difference, but in any other armor class, I think there's going to be focus on other things. What is interesting here is that this doesn't seem to affect enfeebling or weaken, which is another factor in how much damage you take, and this might be the new way to reduce any incoming damage. The next change is of similar importance here, critical hits. Changed critical hit damage calculation to be additive instead of multiplicative. Adjusted critical hit chance to no longer increase your total crit hit chance for every non-critical hit that occurs. Now the chance will only increase by the weapon's base critical hit chance for each non-critical hit that is triggered. In short, you get much lower chance to get crits after your first crit hit because the weapon crit chance itself is usually not very high. The high crit chance comes from things like having keen or having a ring with keen awareness. In addition to that, increase the base critical hit chance on Fire Staff, Void Gauntlet, Ice Gauntlet by 6%, on the bow by 2%, and all other weapons by 4%. So this will offset that a little bit because generally you're going to have a much lower chance to crit, but it's still going to be lower than before for sure. Then we have the PvP enemy persistent spell VFX. In other words, this is where you will see a red circle around enemy spells like Sacred Grounds or anything that can damage you as well. Equip loads are getting a change too. The CC increase that you can currently get from heavy armor especially, but also a bit from medium, is going away. Instead, you now get a CC decrease. If you're in heavy equip load, the duration of crowd control is reduced by 20%, and in medium equip load, it's reduced by 10%. Now, this is pretty important because it kind of brings up the question how much freedom you're going to be running in those equip loads. You can probably just stack all of it, or you can choose to say, I don't need that much freedom because I already have 20% reduction here for my heavy set. And there are other benefits to running heavy or heavier loadouts in general with the fortification as well, so we're probably going to see some very interesting shifts in the general loadout meta. And speaking of shifts, we're also seeing a shift in the attribute meta. Moved the 300 strength attribute bonus to be the 300 con bonus and updated the functionality of the strength attribute bonus to grant increased base damage on heavy attacks. Very interesting change. I know a lot of people have been requesting this for a long time and saying it makes more sense to have this on 300 con, so you're not getting overly rewarded for having 300 strength, so only the tanks really are the ones that get the grid because they need it more, because they need to be in the middle of things longer. I think it is logical, I think it's fine. It's gonna frustrate a lot of players, obviously. If you're running a 300 strength build with thwarting strikes right now, you either have to choose between not running that anymore and re-gearing, or switching to 300 con. So yeah, it's gonna change how bruisers in general are playing. I think the 300 strength bonus that is gonna be there instead is also not particularly strong. Increased base damage on heavy attacks, as far as I'm aware, this is 10%, which is really not that important for most players most of the time. Not many weapons consistently use heavy attacks in melee. The only one that obviously comes to mind here is primarily Greatsword, but Greatsword is getting a bunch of nerfs this patch anyways, and Greatsword usually isn't that great when you run it with 300 strength. It was more of a weapon that in many PvP situations you'd run with a split of strength and dex, so for those players it doesn't really matter that much either, and they already get their grid on heavies anyways, so yeah, I don't know how this is gonna go. I don't know what people are gonna run now. I could see a lot more people speccing 250 strength maybe instead, and then maybe try to get the 50 dex perk or something if they have a weapon that scales with it. Maybe even the 50 int perk if we're going all crazy. We'll see, but definitely a shift away from the 300 strength bruiser meta. They also fixed a dodge roll exploit, and they fixed an issue with the 200 strength perk and 250 dex perk not working properly. I talked about the 200 strength perk recently, so I'm happy to hear that, and this should now consistently be working. Magic heavy weapon attack buffers were updated to be more reliable. Have to see how that actually feels in game. They fixed an issue where you could perform attacks with the wrong weapon by spamming the attack and swapping inputs. They updated the 250 strength attribute bonus to be more clear about the functionality, and it's really not from what I've seen. We'll see if the final version of that is better, and then I'll talk about if it actually works now, because it's really, really weird right now in terms of how it's supposed to work and what it's supposed to do. They fixed an issue where players could immediately transition into a fall and bypass reaction if a stagger or knockdown was triggered while jumping. Very important. And also they capped exhaust and increased stamina regeneration by 50% each. This is going to be interesting. I think they will counteract each other somewhat, but for example, exhaustive netshot right now has more than 50% exhaust when on your weapon, so that would go over cap, but then it's probably countered by stalwart or nimble. Spell aiming indicators are now preloaded, so that during high load periods there is no delay showing them when using ability. Also great, that will feel a lot more fluid. As they announced, we're getting a ton of new taunts. The first one is Calamity Counter, now having a 8-second AoE taunt on activation. Mighty Gavel gets a 4-second taunt, but this one is only on hit, so it's not actually that effective because it's not that big of an AoE most of the time. Maelstrom gets a 4-second on-hit taunt, that's a great one. Cyclone gets a 2-second on-hit taunt, so you can definitely tank better with a Great Axe now. There's a lot of taunting going around there. The really spicy ones are what we get on the mage weapons. Incinerate now gets a 3-second on-hit taunt. Probably not big enough of a radius to really tank with it, but as an offhand it should work. And similarly, Wind Chill gets a 3-second on-hit taunt, so you can really add utility to tanking now with your offhand especially. Petrifying Scream also gets a 4 seconds on-hit taunt. The problem here is also that the radius is probably not big enough. It would be amazing to actually do full Void Blade tanking otherwise. And then Blast Shot also gets a 4-second on-hit taunt. Magic weapons no longer have any mana cost on their light attack. I think that is great, that will feel a lot better. Mana should really not be a big deal in New World, I feel. Crowd Control Balance reviewed all weapons to make a more clear differentiation between attacks that are intended to be for crowd control and attacks that are meant for damage. Removed stagger from damage focused abilities and removed damage from stagger focused abilities. This is going to be massive and affects pretty much all weapons. The first one of those is the Warhammer. Shockwave damage is reduced from 80 to 60%, Wrecking Ball damage is reduced from 130 to 90%, Clear Out damage is reduced from 115 to 100%, and Path of Destiny is reduced from 100 to 70%. This is a heavy hit to the Warhammer overall. That's just so much damage taken off, especially on Path of Destiny, which obviously is used as a stagger tool, but also as a partial damage tool. So yeah, this is rough for the Warhammer, especially because Wrecking Ball is being hit so hard too, when it used to be one of the more reliable burst combos that you could do with the Warhammer. So really the Warhammer is getting pushed more into a utility direction, I would say, because Mighty Gavel, for example, which is a damage-focused ability, is just not good in PvP. Sword and Shield, the shield bash damage from the Intimidating Bash upgrade specifically is reduced from 100 to 75% weapon damage, not that much. Shield Rush is reduced from 125% to 100%. Shield Rush Improved Rush Weaken is increased from 10% to 20%. This is massive, especially because weakens are going to be so important now that Fortify is less impactful. Leaping Strike damage is reduced from 150% to 100%, very rough for DPS Sword and Shield builds. And Reverse Stab no longer staggers. This honestly really feels like they do not want Sword and Shield to be a DPS weapon, or a PvP damage weapon at least. Especially because of the Leaping Strike nerf here. I never considered Leaping Strike to primarily be a CC ability. I think it's more of a damaging ability, so your damage will just almost exclusively come from your light attacks now. Which I guess is still decent on the sword, but still, I think generally a very rough change for that loadout as well. Spear is getting changes that are questionable? Javelin gets its damage reduced from 125% to 80%. This makes sense in the context of what they're doing for others. Kind of rough for those who use Spear as a bow offhand combo. Perforate's final upgrade, Impactful Strikes, no longer staggers and was reworked to inflict a stack of 10% weaken for 5 seconds on each successful hit with 3 stacks maximum. This is crazy. This weapon has so much weaken already through Enfeebling Skewer, and now it's getting another 30%. I don't know what to say about that other than wow. It's in terms of 1v1 capabilities, this is a massive buff. You just can't trade into a spear. Obviously 1v1 is just a small portion of the game, but I think this will have an impact on at least arenas as well, and any situation where you get caught off in a 1v1 situation. So yeah, you really just run from a spear now if you see it, I guess. Sweep knockdown attack damage is reduced from 75% to 45% too. Greatsword's Calamity counter damage is reduced from 100 to 80%. By the way, this is just the first batch of changes. There are other changes for Greatsword, for example, later on as well. Steadfast Strike's first attack damage is reduced from 70 to 40%. Very, very low value. And Skyward Slash first attack damage is reduced from 80 to 50%. I think especially the Steadfast Strike here, it really is a heavy swing in terms of damage output. On the Rapier, Flourish and Finish no longer staggers, and Flurry's final hit no longer staggers either. Instead, it applies a bleed, so it can be utilized better by other skills in a tree. Now, I think especially the Flourish and Finish change will get some people by surprise here, because I know that not that many people are aware of how Flourish and Finish is used in PvP, but as of now, as of recent, it's become more and more frequent that people are using Flourish and Finish as a self-peel tool, where the double stagger is extremely potent because you can cut enemies out of a lot of abilities. Basically anything that doesn't have grit is being held back significantly by the enemy using Flourish and Finish. And this is something that really came to light with the Greatsword, because the Greatsword players aren't necessarily running 300 strength, and the Greatsword generally doesn't have that much grit in the kit. So a Rapier was excellent self-peel against the Greatsword. But in the same way, many other weapons with staggers were nerfed. The Rapier also got changed the same way. The Great Axe has its first Reap hit reduced from 70 to 60%, but much more importantly, the Gravity Well melee swing damage, this is the one that you have to really be close to in the first place, was reduced from 99% to 25%. The Gravity Well's Vortex Burst damage was reduced from 125% to 100%, and Insatiable Gravity Well burst damage was reduced from 100% to 50%. So you'll probably still use Grav well because the utility is massive, but the damage is definitely taking down. It's more that you have to follow up with Maelstrom now the moment you get in there essentially to deal that damage, or just use another weapon to follow up in terms of damage. In the Hatchet, the Feral Rush's first hit is reduced from 115% to 80%, but the Hatchet will get what is coming its way. Hang on. Bow has its evade shot damage reduced from 125 to 90%, so it seems like they're also targeting abilities that are used as escapes, even though obviously it has a stagger too. Rapid shot also no longer staggers. Musket has the stopping power damage reduced from 120% to 90%. Ice Spike's Mighty Spike on the Ice Gauntlet no longer staggers. The Void Gauntlet has the damage of Scream nerfed from 100% to 70%. Blunderbuss just gets a bunch of fixes to how Mortar Charge works here, just mostly bug fixes. The bow gets a bunch of ability updates to Penetrating Shot. The Deep Strike upgrade reduced the damage from 20% to 15%. The Long Range passive reduced the damage from 15 to 10%. Opening Strike passive reduced damage bonus from 20 to 10%. And Finishing Shot passive reduced the damage from 20 to 15%. This should be a quite noticeable reduction overall between all of these different passives that increase your damage when you're using a heavy attack or using a damage against a high health target or whatnot. Don't remember all of them from the top of my head, but generally speaking, this will take down the damage quite a fair bit. Along with that, there's a fix to the bow dodge and weave passive that was improperly extending the duration if a subsequent dodge occurred while the buff was already active. Next, we have the fire staff rework. Now, this is absolutely massive. This is completely gigantic in terms of how the fire staff will work now. This is something I don't think I can fully summarize in the context of this patch notes because there's already so much stuff going on otherwise. Instead, I will show you the full skill trees and everything in a separate video where I'll talk about that. If you want to see that, hit subscribe and click the bell so you get notified when that comes out. It probably should be later today or tomorrow latest because it's just a massive thing by itself that would fill probably more than 20 minutes to cover. I'll briefly show you the changes here just to skip over them. But realistically, it's so much that's not even in here that you really need to see the full skill trees as one. At this point, you probably get the general idea. It is a lot. We're moving on to the Great Axe for now. Gravity Well gets a change and is now considered a ranged attack. This is important because this means that Elemental Aversion will now counter Gravity Well, which is pretty significant for walls. Charge gets an update to the incorrect range description from 10 meters to 15 meters. There's also a bunch of bug fixes here. Fixed an issue where Engage could hit twice. Fixed an issue where some damage bonuses were not properly functioning with the Bloodlust ultimate. Fixed an issue that would cause Gravity Well Vortex to disappear if a target hit by it died immediately. And fixed an issue where the roots applied by the Gravity passive for the Great Axe would apply through blocks. And now we have one that I know a lot of you have been waiting for, the Greatsword. The primary and heavy attack homing is being adjusted to be consistent with other melee weapons. No idea what that actually means because the melee weapons aren't even consistent between them, but it's nerfed, that's all I can tell from this. Giant Slayer is just getting a tooltip update to be more obvious about what it means, and the Path of Onslaught quick charge bonus is getting nerfed. Increase the time it takes to charge a heavy attack while in the Path of Onslaught stance to be only 50% faster instead of twice as fast. Likely an absolutely massive change, but somewhat hard to tell because the charge that is changed is not the full animation of the Greatsword heavy attack, I think. We tried figuring this out. XR sent me some stuff regarding the numbers for this, and it seems that normally you have roughly 5 and something seconds for 3 swings, whereas with the Onslaught swings you would do that same in 3.5 seconds-ish, something like that. But anyways, it's not quite half at the moment because there's a pre and a post animation, a swing animation possibly, where this may not apply. This is our theory at least. And if that's the case, then it's not really a 50% reduction at the moment, which is why this slowdown that you would experience through this change here would not be as noticeable as you may think. Because it would just increase the time to like 4-ish seconds, which wouldn't really make a massive difference. Again, this is just a working theory. It could also be that this is actually just a tooltip change, unlikely but possible. So we'll have to wait and see how exactly this feels afterwards, but we'll try around with it. Either way, it seems to be at least to be intended to be a nerf. Crosscut gets the cooldown increased from 15 to 20 seconds. I don't understand this. I don't know. Somebody on this team really hates Crosscut. Who even still uses Crosscut? Why are you using Crosscut? What is wrong with you? I'm sorry, but this ability is just very rarely useful. So I don't know why you would increase the cooldown of it. I don't care. Like, it's not bad because Crosscut is already bad, so it's not really a problem in that sense. It's just weird. It's a strange decision. Maybe Crosscut may be a little bit better now that the heavy swing speed is a bit slower, so maybe that's why, but then you're still not getting the bleed from it, so I doubt it. The Adaptive Rush upgrade on Relentless Rush has the root reduced from 1 second to 0.5 seconds. If there's one change that I dislike, is this one. The root was already very short and very conditional, and with something else that is coming in this patch as well, it's even harder to hit anyways, and now it's just an 0.5 seconds root. I don't see why anyone would want to spec into that at this point, because it's such a short time, it's such a low value in that, when it is already very short on 1 second and feels like it should be closer to 1.5 seconds, honestly. Like I said, I think the Greatsword deals too much damage, but the utility on it is very lackluster, and they nerfing one of the last utility aspects it had, which allowed you to, when you are in onslaught stance, get the one heavy attack, not guaranteed but very likely off while they're in the root. So it seems like they really didn't want this combo to happen, but that begs the question, why does this ability have a root in the first place? As it stands, you're going to be stuck in the animation still while the enemy is already out of the root. The Giant Slayer passive is also nerfed, reducing the damage from 20% to 15%. Completely ridiculous because one of the worst perks on the tree that hardly anyone is actually using. Don't know why they're nerfing it, don't really care because you shouldn't be using it in the first place. It's a very minuscule damage increase most of the time. Swift Onslaught passive changed activation condition to trigger off ability hits and not ability activations. That is extremely annoying because it makes it much harder to catch up to someone when you could previously use, for example, Skyward Slash to get the movement speed, or if you're just traveling around the world, you just use Relentless Rush to travel faster. And the Greatsword otherwise isn't exactly a super fast weapon for traveling around, whereas some other weapons already do that much better. So yeah, I don't think this is great. This is just annoying primarily, though I can see why they want to do that. I'm definitely not a fan though. They updated several of the Greatsword tooltips to add clarity when the stance takes effect. Information included in the base stance notes that to state that the stances are activated after completing ability. For the attacks that have multiple hits, added information to indicate which portion of the attacks needs to be completed to activate the stances. This is likely a result of me reporting a bug, being that on crosscut specifically you need to hit all 3 swings in order to get into onslaught stance. They did not change that and instead just changed the tooltips, so it makes it clear now that that's what they want. Again, crosscut is already very bad. I thought this was maybe a way to make it a little bit more viable, at least give you an easy way to get into onslaught stance. It can't even have that. It just has to be like bad all around, I suppose. And then fix an issue where the Greatsword, Relentless Rush and Skyward Slash abilities would apply their effects through blocks. Fair enough. Generally speaking, I think the nerfs to the Greatsword will not have a massive impact on PvE, but will have a very drastic impact on PvP. I think there's a lot of things here that will just feel very rough in PvP, and I would not be surprised if the number of Greatsword players drops significantly, especially along with the other changes that we're seeing this patch. What I think will not happen is the Greatsword completely disappearing in PvE, because it still has some very effective tools for that, and the damage will be affected because the heavy swing will probably take longer, but not to an extent that I think it would be pushed down from being one of the stronger PvE weapons. Not the strongest one necessarily, but one that can still perform in various ways, especially because much of its damage also comes from the bleed that you stack with your heavy attack, and that is entirely untouched, which honestly surprises me. And there's another weapon we need to spend some time on, which is the Hatchet. Defy Death Ultimate. Reduce invincibility to 0.5 seconds and grants 500 HP plus 50% of max health upon activation, and reduced cooldown from 75 seconds to 60 seconds. Very interesting shift, especially the 50% of max health. I don't know if this is base health or total health, but if this is total health, this is actually very good. The intent of this change is to prevent Defy Death from being a risk-free situation. It still saves the player from death, but it doesn't allow the player to recklessly remain in the fight while not having to focus on their health values. This will actually probably not do that much in PvE, where you use it to avoid one-shot mechanics a lot of the time. You're getting health back anyways. But in PvP, if you're getting attacked by a lot of enemies at once, is where the biggest difference will happen, and I think that needed to happen too. Fortifying Strikes changed the activation condition from 3 consecutive light attacks to 1 heavy attack. I guess this really encourages using a heavy attack in between, weave it in to get the effect of Relentless Fury and this at the same time. At the same time, especially if you're running light, the Fortify might not even matter much anymore, and you might not even be using it because, again, Fortify significantly changed. In ranged strikes, the extra damage you get while the target is below 30% health, 20%, is changed from being all basic attacks to just heavy attacks and abilities. This is a pretty significant DPS cut to the Hatchet, especially on bosses that will be below 30% health quite a bit longer. Berserking Refresh no longer directly gives you health back, and instead gives you 5% lifesteal while Berserk is active. So this is gonna be quite different, especially in PvP, and the situation where you can just run away with Hatchet to heal up are gone. You have to fight into the enemy, and even then I think the 5% lifesteal is likely gonna be less than what you would get from the regeneration most of the time. Desperate Refresh gets a cap of 5 activations per attack for the cooldown reduction passive to match other passives, not a big deal. Relentless Fury and accumulated power weren't working quite properly, so that's getting fixed a little bit here and there. And Desperate Refresh now works for thrown hatchets, so that's pretty cool. Critical Throw apparently also wasn't differentiating between melee and ranged attacks. I don't know in which way though, I'm assuming it was the ranged attacks that didn't get the extra percentage. So the next one here is really interesting. Fixed an issue where the Hatchet ability Infected Throws upgrade, Mortal Power, didn't properly portray the extended duration of the upgrade. Now, the thing is that the normal version was 6 seconds, I think, if I recall correctly, and the Mortal Power upgrade increased that to 10 seconds, and I reported this, and they looked into it, and it appears that they kind of just changed the abilities and just frame it as a wording issue, unless it's bugged on PTR right now. But it seems that now the base duration is 10 seconds, and Mortal Power increases this by an additional 5 seconds, so this effect would be 5 seconds longer on targets below 50% health. 15 seconds of anti-heal is pretty rough. All in all, massive changes to the Hatchet as well. I think a very interesting weapon. I will see where this goes after the patch. I don't really quite know how it can find its niche, but maybe the armor changes will make it so that it's useful somewhere else anyways. But I do think that there are other weapons that would be prioritized in more situations now. Definitely see a lot less of it in Outpost Rush by people that just use it for Defy Death. The Ice Gauntlet can now despawn its Ice Pylon by holding the ability input for 1 second. Also has health and description now. Entomb now includes that you can dodge out of it in the description, and you also get the health values in description too. Windchill gets an added ability input delay of 0.6 seconds after the ability starts to avoid accidental cancellations. I was hoping they just generally speed it up a bit, but hey, it's a start, I suppose. There's a passive change to Cold Reach, where now it will deal higher damage to targets within 15 meters of you instead of further away than 15 meters, which it's kind of weird because it's called reach, but then I guess it's just closer reaching, but I'm not really sure. I feel like in many situations it's a nerf. I'm not really the biggest fan of that one in particular. I'm not sure where that's coming from. Empowered Frost increases the mana gain while performing an attack while inside a frosted area from 3 to 6. Kind of whatever, honestly. Punishing Storm didn't work properly when using Killing Jagged. That is fixed. And the Ice Pylon preventing Gathering Storm from triggering after 3 consecutive light attacks was also fixed. Also, you can no longer melee home towards friendly Ice Pylons. On the Lifestaff, the Absolve passive now only applies to heavy attacks, but that's because light attacks generally don't cost mana anymore. Resulting from that, it's also no longer required to unlock Mending Touch or Blissful Touch if you don't want to have it. The stamina regeneration of Sacred Ground upgrade Holy Ground is reduced from 50% to 25%, so this is a bit of an annoyance factor for tanks, I suppose. But then again, usually Oblivion is the major stamina factor anyways. The bug fixes here are all just revolving around camera binding and targeting and stuff like that, nothing all too major. If you want to look into it, go for it. On the Musket, the traps are changed a little bit so that if you throw out a trap and you get interrupted while doing so, the ability will not go on cooldown. This next point should not actually be under traps, it's a separate point. Tuned aim down sight accuracy to reduce effectiveness of rapid long-range shots. The accuracy will be reduced when moving and aiming quickly. So generally, you probably need telos now in order to be able to aim better with the musket, since the accuracy is just going down in general at long ranges. Going to be very interesting how that actually feels. There's a new passive, which is Steady Hand, and this replaces Ballistic Advantage. Ballistic Advantage was the 50% reduced damage falloff beyond 50 meters, so that in itself is already a nerf. Keep in mind though that this effect never affected the int gem portion, but the other portion is, so the range damage definitely drops off somewhat on the physical side. The new passive here now is increase accuracy of any musket shot when aim down sight is maintained for 2 seconds. Increased accuracy will reset after a shot is fired. So you really want to aim down long in order to get a stable weapon essentially. Steady Hand passive activates in 1 second and resets on shot while in shooter stance. So a little bit different while using shooter stance. It has greater accuracy there apparently. Updated to remove accuracy penalty from hip shot. And also updated the musket's aiming reticles appearance to better function with the musket accuracy system. Generally, a lot of nerfs to the musket here and not really any significant buffs except that one small thing on the trapper tree. So I'm kind of wondering where this leaves the musket. I feel like The long-range nerfs are actually very much appropriate, and I think a lot of people will get what they were asking for here, but I still believe that the Trapper tree in itself needs more, especially because stopping power is also getting a nerf here, so this whole close-range capability for the musket that it could technically have is just not really there yet, I feel, and that's a bit unfortunate. I do believe that the long-range capability should absolutely be nerfed, but I think in close range, the musket should be able to do a little bit more in return. The musket also gets a bunch of fixes to reloads and sticky bomb movement speed and whatnot. One that I think is particularly notable is fixed an issue where the musket trap root was not consistent with the normal diminishing returns on roots when applying the root to a target with a trap while the root is already active, so that should be shorter now. So on shield just got some bug fixes. The defensive formation ultimate showed the incorrect value for its radius, showed 2 meters instead of 3. The Void Gauntlet, the Void Blade also gets that prevention mechanism that you can't immediately cancel it, which I think is good here. And Baleful Tether. Buffs and debuffs now start at maximum values and no longer scale up. Increased projectile size from 0.4 meters to 0.5 meters. That might actually make it a little bit easier to hit. Increased impact damage from 10% to 100%, and added damage tags to the tooltips. Also increased the tether range from 15 to 20 meters. It's a very interesting change. It just deals 10 times as much damage now, so yeah, it might actually be more useful as a projectile attack. Very, very interesting to see where that takes it. The problem with it was always that, along with not being fully rewarding, it was also just very hard to hit. So for more skillful Void Gauntlet players with that slightly increased projectile size, this may now be a more interesting option, maybe along with Orb, maybe in place of Oblivion if you don't want to get close anyway. So yeah, we'll see how that works. On top of that, the Tethered Focus upgrade now also gives you 200% mana regen instead of 100%. The Soul Eater upgrade changed the trigger condition to be if the tether ends or is broken, so you will definitely heal even if an enemy just runs out of the tether. Very, very spicy approach for Baleful Tether. We see somewhat similar treatment to Essence Rupture. The impact damage here is also increased from 50% to 100% and added the damage tags to the tooltips here. Along with that, the projectile size is also increased from 0.33 to 0.5 meters, and the projectile speed is also increased by 50%. So we may actually see a full decay build now. I don't know why it took them so long to actually change anything about these abilities, but it seems like they have finally looked at it and said, okay, maybe we should make this stuff useful in more situations than very niche PvE, because these could actually be cool abilities if the projectiles can actually be hit and they actually deal a little bit of damage too. What is funny is that in many ways these abilities are still utility focused, and they nerfed the damage on so many utility focused things in this particular patch, but then give these guys here massive damage increases, but oh well. Oblivion on the other hand gets a massive nerf, and this may play into Tether being more interesting in some situations as well. The Invigorating Oblivion perk now provides 25% extra stamina generation rate instead of granting a flat amount of stamina per second, which makes a huge difference for tanking because it interacts differently with blocks. You could still get the stamina while blocking, while now you probably can't. This essentially allowed you to skip the stamina regeneration delay and still get stamina, while now it won't, which, along with the nerfs to the stamina regen on Sacred as well, it definitely makes a big difference in PvE. Efficient Harvest has the condition to be below 25% mana removed and now changed the health drain reduction from 50 to 35%. Probably still not worth using for most people, to be honest. Deadly Range updated the condition to be against targets with an active debuff and made it work with both light and heavy attacks. Likewise, Fervent Thirst now also works with both your light and heavy attacks, giving you back mana for hitting debuffed enemies. Cleansing Harvest is a very interesting change. You no longer have Refreshing Harvest, and instead, Harvest can now remove one debuff from yourselves and has a 3 seconds cooldown. So unless you're massively debuffed, you can just very easily, quickly tap that right click, drain a little bit of health, and then go on about your day without having a debuff on you. Now, the problem with that is obviously that this is probably more useful in situations where you would be a Void Blade user, where you get debuffed more often, but in those situations you can't really use it because you're using Void Blade and that turns it into a block. So kind of not perfect in that regard, but definitely still has many use cases. Leeching Balls removed the target health % condition and reduced the amount of bonus healing in return from 30% to 20%, probably still a net buff here. Extended Suffering now works with both light and heavy attacks, so you can very easily continue the duration of non-crowd control debuffs, especially easier with light attacks because they're quicker in the first place, so this is pretty cool. Bug fixes here are just generally functionality issues that are solved. But wait, there is more. This post is so long that they actually needed 2 replies. Now, we have a bunch of fire staff perks here again. I'm going to show them quickly, but once again, we will look at those later in more detail and talk about fire staff specifically. Accuracy perk is getting nerfed, reduced the accuracy perk bonus by 50% from near 100% to 50%. This is interesting because this is clearly aimed at Musket, which will likely need this perk now, and they don't want to make it too strong for them. But I wonder if it's kind of other weapons catching strays through that. I know like certain builds with the blunderbuss, for example, use accuracy for tighter spread, and I don't know what will happen to that now, but I think those were mostly niche cases anyways. I don't know of many people actually using accuracy, so it's probably not that big of a deal, and it's just going to be a Musket thing now. Speaking of Musket especially, Mortal Empowerment. Updated to only last 2 minutes, removed the ability for the duration to be refreshed for each kill, so I guess each individual stack can last up to 2 minutes, or I don't know how else it would work, and reduced the max stack size to 10. Definitely a lot more limited in effectiveness now, and I guess a very good player could still make some use of it, but I think there will probably be better perks to use for most people most of the time. I don't really see how this would still have much value when it's relatively inconsistent, unreliable now, and relatively short. Transient recovery, it was coming eventually. It was unavoidable, sadly. My joyous days of transient recovery are finally over. Reduce the power of lifesteal from charged heavies from 10 to 40% based on gear score to 5 to 20%. Still not bad, but now there are other perks that compete with it much more because the self-sustain here is not the biggest game changer anymore. It also makes a big difference for soloing things in PvE. So, goodbye transient recovery, you had a good run, I suppose. Refreshing Move and Refreshing Torrent set a 0.2 seconds cooldown, so they only trigger 1 instance of cooldown reduction per attack. This is especially crucial for Refreshing Torrent when it comes to PvE content, probably one of the biggest Hatchet nerfs in that regard, if you're looking at PvE specifically, because you can only basically apply it from one target instead of a group of mobs now. Very big deal in that regard. For Refreshing Move, I'm not sure in how many situations you'll actually effectively get multi-procs where it would really work out to be a big deal, but I could imagine that especially for great axes, this would make a significant difference as well in war scenarios. We have the AI Creature Family Bane perks updated to deal 10% additional max damage when on magic or ranged weapons. So a pretty significant increase here to Bane for ranged weapons, especially along with some other changes that we're having, especially the fire staff that might make those more viable in PvE. Some more tooltip fixes here. One of them is regarding stamina recovery, and I'm kind of surprised that stamina recovery itself is not getting changed here. Very big deal change for Fortifying Sacred Ground though. Fixed an issue where the Fortifying Sacred Ground perk functionality would persist after weapon swap if the perk was on armor. As far as I understood that was always intended, and it was only on weapons that it wouldn't happen. But it seems it was not, or at least they don't want it to be that way anymore, which means it's a lot more important for the healer to stick to the life staff most of the time in order to keep the Fortify going. If they switch to a Void Gauntlet for an extended period of time, to like Void Blade or something, that's not gonna help the tank. At the same time, Fortify itself also not that effective anymore for most, except for the tank really, in PvE situations. So yeah, a bit of both here, but also for the healer himself, if you're standing or you're putting a sacred on yourself just to survive somehow and you're getting attacked, and then you switch to your rapier, in that moment you would lose the Fortify. Really surprising approach, because I don't think it's that way for all other abilities. I think there are some perks that just linger. For example, I think stuff like the Ice Gauntlet, the Pylon gets snapshotted. So yeah, this is a bit of an outlier, I suppose, but also a very strong one. And there are also some other perks that change this way, so a bit of both here, but yeah, definitely a pretty heavy nerf in that regard. Lasting Consumption didn't quite work properly, and they updated some tooltips as well to make it a bit clearer. Another very important change, I was talking about the Musket earlier with the fall-off, and it's here, it's still in the patch notes, it's just somewhere else. Fixed a bug where damage gem conversion was not taken into account for calculating damage fall-off based on distance for ranged weapons. In other words, ranged weapon on the musket is double gutted after this. On one hand, from the damage reduction from the perk that is taken away, but also from gem damage now actually working properly and being reduced at range like any other damage. So yeah, actually a double hit to the musket. Really taking down the damage at long range, or the damage potential, especially in combination with the accuracy. Also, higher tiers of ammo were not increasing the damage provided by an elemental gem on the blunderbuss specifically, that's fixed. For Heartrunes, fix an issue where hard gem rune attack damage will not be reduced when using aversion perks, very important. Sword Defender's Resolve ability and Sturdy Shield passive, Great Axe's Enduring Strike, Warhammer's Hardened Steel, and Greatsword's Perfect Vigilance. So quite a few more ways to reduce that damage. In wars, target dummies can no longer be attacked, which is actually a big deal because there were some interactions with the Ice Gauntlet, with the Ice Pylon, that allowed you to stack Heartrunes very easily. Defenders can now select spawn points inside the fort, very interesting. And attackers' siege weapon blueprints for tier 2 and tier 3 now auto-build themselves when being placed. In Outpost Rush, they increased the amount of individual score players get while capturing or contesting the OPR claim circles. I think this is something that they actually already put in the patch, but yeah, very glad to see that. This is only your personal score, not the overall team score. Arena get a bunch of minor visual fixes and stuff like that, but one important fix being a cranberry compote can no longer be used in PvP arenas, which was a bit of an unfair advantage because there's only one in the entire game, and if you accidentally used it somewhere else, then you would not have this advantage. Invasions get a big buff. Improved the invasion rewards. Players will now receive 3 pieces of epic or greater corruption ward armor, a weapon, and a chance at invasion jewelry. So quite a lot of interesting stuff. Invasions will now give significantly more umbral shards, territory standing, coin, and faction tokens. Also fixed in a world markers on gates and capture points not showing up for players that join a war mid-invasion or mid-match. So a lot of new things or additional things that make participating in invasions more appealing. Definitely gonna be interesting. I might just hop into one after a very long time now of not doing them, just to see how much you can actually get from them. A bunch of minor fixes here. One that is interesting is that Deep Roots, an armor that allowed you to get a gem with extra damage on it, is now going to be fixed. An interesting addition is added a function to allow procedurally generated epic items to be upgraded to 600 gear score and roll an additional perk. Apparently this is a specific modifier that's only applied to some items, currently only to the Outpost Rush weapons from the caches. It would be very interesting to see if they apply that to more drops in the future. Weapons that were previously unobtainable are now possible rewards from some arena bosses. Question is which weapons in particular, but we'll have to dig into that. The loot tables for ammunition now include everything up to tier 5 ammo, so you can just get tier 5 ammos while doing chest runs, or recalcum ammos that is. Added the perk Resilient as a possible perk when crafting items using the Summer Medley Fair crafting patterns. This affects Colorful Kraken, Sturgeon Style, and Masked Mackerel. This is probably going to be very interesting for some people, with that event not being too far away as well. A bunch of Ice Gauntlets are getting new perks. I have to look into them in detail. They had a bunch of melee perks. For example, Cold Stone had Sturdy. I actually wanted to farm that, but apparently those didn't even work in the first place. They added the ability to use golden scarabs in tier 5 tools and bags, which is very cool. What's interesting is they said they wanted to add the runestone stopwatches to that as well, but now it says updated the description for runestone stopwatch to be more descriptive about its purpose. So I'm not sure if it'll actually be able to be used on bags and tools as well. I think people were more excited to be able to use runestone stopwatches on their tier 5 bags and tools, because the chance of getting 600 gear score is higher, and therefore getting that additional perk is higher compared to golden scarabs. All normal tier 2 to tier 4 crafted gear now has locked levels no matter what gear score you crafted at. The first XP bonus is increased from 2 times to 3 times instead, and they said that we all get a reset for those bonus effects as well. Musical instruments get a bit of an overhaul. The trade skill experience gained from performance is now based on individual notes hit, modified by the quality of performance, relevant perks, and group size. Increased the solo experience buff for the music perk Spotlight from 10 to 15%. Fishing trophies should now finally show the correct luck values. Also, the trade skill experience gained from music performance is increased, and exponentially increased experience gained per player in a group performance. So it sounds like it's better to do music leveling in groups now, as far as I understand it here. Would be cool, would be interesting. The health bar over enemy players no longer disappears immediately if their player goes to full health. This is, I think, a great change because that was always a bit of a visibility issue. After crafting an item, the crafting screen will now leave the previously selected ingredients in place until you select a different recipe. This is huge for mass crafting. Now, all in all, this is an insane amount of changes that will especially affect PvP a lot, I think. I'm very much looking forward to seeing more of this patch once the PTR hits live. For now, I will tell you to subscribe and click the bell, because later today we'll probably be talking about the Fire Staff, otherwise tomorrow. And there's so much spicy stuff going on with that. Thanks to my patrons for supporting this video, and thank you for watching. Duke Sloth, out.